So I was watching this video by Veritas et Caritas. This YouTuber in the video that I was watching was ranking historical channels by what and who they were based on a bunch of criterias. Now, the video is not mainly about that, but instead, I think his methods were flawed in how he ranked things. But I will say that I was happy to see that the highest person he ranked on there was someone called Home Team History, who covers African content. The reasons why he ranks him so high is, something that I kind of agree with, but at the same time, it's interesting to see that he has a, I would say, leftist bias when it comes to history. He, in fact, mentions this when he talks about the fact that Home Team History mentions empire in a positive way by saying things like the greatest empire or any of that. And he said that in scholarly works, they don't do that anymore, which is a moral decision, but I don't think it's a question of accuracy. So now I will react to his video and what he thinks about the whole thing.
Home Team History. Home Team History is a remarkable channel, firstly because it focuses specifically on African history, in particular lesser known people, places and events, and secondly because of its size.
So let us first see what he has inside of the D tier and the E tier. So you can see nobody got an A, a B, or a C, but some people got a D and an E by the time it gets to Home Team History. After this, there's another channel which gets ranking, but I'm not really interested in that. So why would he rank Home Team History higher than these ones? Well, there's an interesting story to this, and I think part of it is because not a lot of people know about Africa, and so not a lot of people can disagree except for obvious information.
750,000 subscribers as of the time of writing this script, a huge size for such a niche history channel.
So I will admit that I have seen Home Team History, and even though I enjoy some of the videos, I think a lot of them are way too short, especially when discussing some of the topics that they talk about. But I think the thing that I appreciate about this channel is that it has successfully talked about Africa and had the large audience that it has, and I think it's still growing. As I saw recent videos in which I'll just leave it there. Recent videos which they had, which are a little more detailed than they used to be for some reason, and I think that the history, as I've seen so many African channels that retired and returned, I think that the history of Africa, some people, and I include this channel as well, were looking at it too superficially, and they didn't realize there were as much personal information that you can get from the history by actual historians who were inside of those kingdoms, but instead they go by source interpretations of original sources.
Home Team is well known among other Africana history channels, and I would suggest the creator is something of a forerunner by virtue of their size and the breadth of subjects they cover.
The thing that I like about Home Team History is that they try to be honest, even if it's mainstream honesty. They try to be honest about their channel and where they lie on certain information. I do think that they probably need to be swayed more by the Afrocentric side of things. But besides that, I think they are or he is very accurate about a lot of information. And he does the same thing that I do, where he will put the sources on the video, but not necessarily in the links, which I forget to do that. But yes, he does that.
They have a strong following on Patreon, with 572 patrons as of the time of writing this script, and at a minimum subscription fee of $5, they're earning a modest but sizable income from their work. In addition to being found on several websites run by and for the American black diaspora, Home Team History is also occasionally recognized in other media, such as receiving a promotional comment in an edition of The Cult Nation, an online magazine specializing in underground culture.
So let me state two things since he is talking about the background of this channel. I am not making a critique of Home Team History's channel. I'm just looking at how this person is interpreting how he judges some of the other channels.
I've been subscribed to Home Team History for some time, and I've appreciated their efforts to produce well-sourced content with intellectual honesty towards the subjects they cover, especially when they have a personal bias in a specific direction, which they typically acknowledge.
So, as impressive as it is to acknowledge the fact that you have a bias, probably a more impressive thing is to avoid the bias altogether.
When their videos do veer into speculative or less substantiated claims, they usually acknowledge this and qualify their statements accordingly. Home Team History has only appeared twice on Our Bad History, although this isn't necessarily an indicator of the quality of their videos, and is attributable more likely to the fact that their channel is addressing a niche of history with which many people are unfamiliar.
I'm sure that's part of it, but also there's not a lot of opinion going around about African history when it relates to pure African history, because those opinions are shoved inside of academia and only people who are academics would really argue. A lot of them are easy to search. If you sat down with a piece of paper and you searched a lot of things that African historians say, you could easily go and find out whether or not they're quoting a source correctly. Now, here's a problem. Because there isn't a lot of research done or research out there about African or interpretations of African original sources. I mean, I've seen a lot there. I could quote some people who I follow as historians on YouTube on African history, particularly the Kingdom of Congo. But there isn't that many people, and so there isn't enough debate to say yay or nay in either way. So when you see something that Ibn Battuta or one of these people say about African culture, it's easy to just state it flat out. But as someone who's skeptical like myself, when I quote it, I have to make sure that I show that I'm quoting Ibn Battuta saying it, because I don't know if it happened or didn't happen. And we know there's a bunch of things, a bunch of information in ancient history which is quotable, but then when you go and check the evidence against it, it's not real. Which is one of the reasons why I don't correct the information based on what I think, because it has to start with somebody mentioning that information. I've noticed that 90% of the, well, not 90%, let's say 30% of the kingdoms that I've mentioned in West Africa, you can't even find one video about them. Not even, nobody has mentioned any of these kingdoms, even though they have people, sources, sites in books written in the 1600s, 1700s, 1300s. Everybody just keeps talking about the same four kingdoms in Africa: Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Mali, Egypt, Ethiopia, sometimes Kanem Bornu. But even there, they like lie about the information and how obvious it is. One of the things that I hate about African history is that gaps are not acknowledged. And even I try to acknowledge those gaps, but gaps are not acknowledged because you have to tell a story. And a story with a gap is an incomplete story.
One point I want to make about Home Team History is that they often start with quite bold claims about African history, which they sometimes acknowledge are speculative, but for which they then present some evidence which apparently gives the claim credibility.
This is where I want to criticize some of the stuff that this person, in the way that they interpreted these other channels, is that some of these bold claims are clickbait, and that has to do with the format. I think in the same way that a book would have a title that is fancy or beyond, and then they'd have to silently justify it by saying it's only their opinion. I think in that same way, that's more a format thing than it is a personal thing. Like, there's definitely people, when they make a video where they'll be like, the most evil woman in history. But if you watch the video, clearly the person is not that evil. That has to do with format. And I think taking away points for that is wrong.
They then follow this with qualifications and cautions, moderating the original claim without actually contradicting it or walking away from it completely.
Without saying exactly what these claims are that this person has not walked away from, and also some of them, it sounds like, would be opinions. Without stating which ones they are, I can't accurately sit here and say yes or no with what he's claiming, that they're bold claims.
While the qualifications and cautions are to be applauded, often the overall impression is that the claim is sound, or at least credible.
Okay, so let me just start and say where I start. I think that home team history takes a mainstream view approach to the research. And I don't mean mainstream in the sense of academia. I mean mainstream in the sense of what most people believe in history. And I think that stating this as a negative or a positive is probably not fair, considering the fact that this is what the mainstream believe anyway. For example, one of the beliefs that he has, which I have a little bit of problem with, is the whole North Africans look like Middle Easterners, and that's just that. Now, I don't completely disagree that there's a lot of Middle Eastern DNA in North Africa, but I do believe that there's a question that needs to be answered, which is, why is it that other Arab scholars have said, or Arab people have said, that there has been a movement inside of there changing the demographics of the people, but that can't be acknowledged? I'm not saying that the people weren't Middle Eastern at the in the north. They could all be Middle Eastern with not even a shred of African, but not acknowledging the fact that the whole demographic, the people over there changed, and that they were cited as much darker than you would say the people in North Africa are today. I think it's a disservice to some degree.
An example is found in Home Team History's video, A History of the Dogon and Their Ancient Science, in which he says this, quote, "The religious beliefs of the Dogon were first documented in studies conducted during the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
This is a good example because I've heard this Dogon claim forever and ever. And when I look into it, it seems like, first of all, Dogon culture doesn't seem to be as solid as a lot of people claim it is. It seems like it changed over the hundreds of years, over the thousands of years, or hundreds of years of its existence. And it seems like they don't have a full grip of where exactly they come from, blaming things like the Telem as some of their origin. And so people making claims about them having great cosmology and stuff like that, I don't know where they get this idea from. Again, when I look it up, I see the same level of intellectual understanding of cosmology or the cosmos, the same way that basically every other kingdom in Africa did. Just an appreciation of the heavenly bodies. The scientific part of it is something that is seen in more sophisticated people, like the people of Timbuktu or Swahili Coast or other people like that.
By French anthropologists Marcel Grial and Germain Dittelin. A very interesting aspect of Grial's observation of Dogon cosmology lies with the suggestion that the Dogon know subtle details of the star system of Sirius beyond what might be reasonably observed with the naked eye.
So I've shown that the star systems, including the Pleiades and all of these, were acknowledged by African tribes, and a lot of African tribes had different names for things like the Pleiades, and a lot of it was attached to the culture, especially animals, animism, and stuff like that. So this is about the level that the Dogon have on cosmology. Anything greater than that is related to modern science is not real. And I apologize to anyone who's offended by that, but it's just there's nothing deeper there.
End quote. Note the carefully placed qualifier that this is a suggestion. Home Team History goes on to explain that these religious beliefs of the Dogon people were interpreted by Grill and Dieterlen, that the Dogon were not only aware of the stars Sirius A and Sirius B, which are not observable from Earth with the naked eye, but that they also knew the duration of their orbits, which they celebrated.
So I'm not going to do a deep dive over here, but based on what he said, anything that's not observable with the naked eye in space, no one could see it in the sky until telescopes were invented. That's just an easy one. Like it's impossible. I know that we want to believe that people in the past were way smarter than what they are, and I will to some degree give it to them that there's stuff they probably knew that we don't know how they knew. But no one had a telescope, no one had anything close to a telescope, and half of the stuff they believed about space is such nonsense that wasting your time looking at the heavens for great answers from ancient tribes is silly, which is one of the reasons why I made my video about ancient Egyptians not having this super great knowledge about the earth being round, which is something that Isaac Newton writes about as if it's this great thing as well, where they use their pyramids and all of that. But using very simple evidence like the fact that they never depict it as round, but instead of it as a disc. And you will see if you look at Dogon art, you can tell that it's just typical African, sophisticated. They live in brick houses. They live pretty good. They learned from some of the earlier people who were there. They use iron. They wear good clothes. They're not like a tribe that's just a normal tribe. But the overestimation is annoying.
This is a well-known anthropological topic documented in many sources, from the rigorously academic to the ridiculously pseudoscientific. Much has been written by anthropologists about the lack of proper procedure followed in the original studies, and the lack of firm evidence that the anthropologists who conducted them actually interpreted correctly what was being told to them, rather than simply reading their own knowledge into the statements made by the interviewees.
So I have personal experience of this. So there's a book by a, let's say, a historian. I don't know what to call him. He was a bishop. It's called Bishop Colenso. You can look it up on anywhere, really, on Google if you want. Bishop Colenso documented a lot of information about the Zulus, about their religion, their culture, the stars, and all of that. And there's a lot of information on the Zulu culture, which is how I know some of the levels of sophistication that existed at the time, because they were documented by people who were there. Then there's people like Frank Charles, and there's all kinds of Europeans who interacted with them and documented information. Some of these people were from different countries and didn't have close to the same agenda. Others hated the Zulus, and people like Frank Charles or people like Bishop Colenso, they had a much lighter interpretation. I mean, still kind of racist, but they had a much lighter interpretation of these people. But I can read Zulu and I can see his English interpretation of what is said to him. And instantly I can see that he is misinterpreting or miswriting on the other side what is told to him. For example, so in Zulu, a lot of time gender is not stated ever. Gender is never stated in Zulu. So if you tell someone come here in Zulu, or like in English, you would be like she has to come here or something like that. So you would always gender it. In the Zulu version, there is no third person gender pronouns or anything like that. And so when this person states something, this person makes a interpretation that the person they're talking about is a man. So I'll give you an example. So in the dream of a person who is worshiping their ancestors, the people in the Zulu kingdom state that a ancestor will visit you, and this ancestor that visits you will then give you information about your real life in your dream. Sometimes in real life they'll come in as a snake. In the interpretation of this person, it's turned to a he. The ancestor who visits you is almost always referred to as a he, but this is not gendered in their statement. Even some of the early interpretations of Nkulunkulu, which is the supreme god in ancient Zulu traditions, is neither male nor female, but today is connected to the Christian God, so it's considered a male. But the way that it's written is giving the impression that it's a male. Now, in one part of this, he does interpret it as someone said to the person, we do not know what the gender of this person. The word Nkulunkulu comes from the word the greatest of the great. In other words, the oldest of the old, the first to come. And so they always preface it within his writings that no one knows what this person looked like or was. And one of the interpretations is that they were genderless, or they were a man, or they were both, or it's two people. Another acknowledgement that is ignored is that this person, the person talking about the ancestors, does not say whether or not when you will return as the same gender. But this is assumed inside of the book. So if you quote unquote died, according to the Zulu tradition, you don't die, you just transition. But if you quote unquote died in the Zulu tradition, then you will be transitioned into the same gender that you were when you died. This is not in there. It's not written. I've read the original version. It's not written in there. It's something that he reads into it. And also, when they say the spirit returns, it doesn't say that the person will be familiar to you at all, except that it will be your ancestor because the person belongs to you. Now, of course, the other bad interpretation about this is that they look at it as if a ancestor is separate from the animism, as if it's two different things. Because of Eurocentric categorization of religion, they separate ancestral worship with animism, which is clearly connected within the ancient Zulu culture. Take, for example, the fact that one of your ancestors will come back as a snake. And then it says, if a snake enters your house, do not kill it because that is probably an ancestor. So the question then is that ancestral worship, is that a deity? I mean, is it a god in the same way that we understand what a god is? Is it a ghost? Is it a zombie? Is it the undead? Is that necromancy? Some of the people existing at the time interpreted it as superstition, and that these people, the Zulus, are actually atheists.
Unfortunately, Home Team History does not provide any of this context and only cites an opposing view by Carl Sagan, instead of all the evidence and arguments made by anthropologists and scientists demonstrating there is little reason to accept this interpretation of Dogon religion.
While I do like Carl Sagan and I also like Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos, it is kind of annoying that some people quote stuff they say, especially about culture, as if it's like a fact. So some of the one of the ones that I can use as an example is when they talk about a comet and what it meant to the Zulus. One comet, and they were like, "Oh, it's like a sign for war." First of all, that goes against the entire Zulu history because war really only mattered when Shaka Zulu came, but the Zulus are way older than that, and they were considered one of the most peaceful tribes at the time. The person who ran them made sure of that. At least that's how their history is interpreted. But they privilege the period after Shaka Zulu as if he is the core to the Zulu nation, which he definitely was not. In fact, he was so against the Zulu nation in terms of what they stood for in the beginning that on several occasions they wanted to remove him completely from the empire until they did for real, where they killed him. Another problem is that a lot of the beliefs of tribes are regional. So some part of the Zulu nation will believe in a myth about the stars or the comets, but it's all regional. Like I've shown with the talking beads in Zulu land, you have to understand the particular culture itself. People in the southern parts of KZN effectively are part of a different tribe before they joined the Zulu nation. And so to say that the Zulus always had the same belief is just incorrect.
In the same video, Home Team History goes on to say, quote, there are other speculative aspects of Dogon cosmology that give the impression of a deeper relationship between Dogon myth and actual science.
By the way, so far, everything that Home Team History has said is kind of okay, because how can he not state that these beliefs exist about the Dogon? As long as he's not agreeing with them, I think it's fine. Also, I want to state that the Dogon as well are not as simple as any of these tribes. They have various factions about them. They clearly don't agree on everything with each other. But again, you'd have to go deeper into that, and that's not what we're going to do today. That's why I kind of used one that I can bring up offhand, which are the Zulus.
End quote. Note the careful use of words such as speculative and give the impression of. Although these cautions are good practice, unfortunately, these strong qualifications later disappear. Home Team History then explains, quote, the Dogon conceived of the unformed universe as a kind of primordial ball that contained all of the potential seeds or signs of the future universe, end quote. Adding, quote, Dogon artistic renderings of it take the same cone-like shape as the event horizon of a black hole in science, end quote.
Let's start with something very important here. Very little cultures in the world stick to what they started with in the beginning. I mean, if you look at the ancient Egyptian mythology, even though they had writing and drawing and all of that from the beginning, and then we look at ancient Egyptian mythology at the end, there's tens of gods that have been added. A lot of them are foreign, so Nubian born, and a lot of them have gone through certain spheres and they've become less important or more important based on who was popular. And this is another thing that I wanted to mention. The gods were, a lot of them were regionally supported. So in some places, not Seth, but one of the other gods like Horus would be a key god in the region. And then later, the key god would be, pick another one, a female deity or something, and then later would be another one, and over the years it would change. This completely changes the interpretation of the religion, but yet when we think of the word ancient Egyptian mythology, we're thinking of it as if it's this continuous thing throughout. I mean, take Christianity for example. Christianity is not continuous. There's so many different factions, and there are groups like Seventh Day Adventists, which I have to admit I don't even know what that means, but there are groups where you can tell that the religion is not being interpreted in the same way. And so to imagine that African cultures, especially ones that had limited writing systems, would have this level of continuous accuracy is, it's beyond mythological.
The implication here is very obviously that the Dogon religion already had some understanding of black holes thousands of years before modern science.
Now, I'm glad if this is something that Home Team History said, I'm not sure if he's making the claim, but if it's something he said, I'm glad I didn't see that information first, because that's the type of information that'll make me stop watching a channel. If they make claims like the Dogon were aware of black holes.
In case this is unclear, Home Team History continues, saying explicitly, quote, Dogon descriptions of the formation of the universe from Alma's egg are distinctly reminiscent of the Big Bang theory in science, end quote. Although the words distinctly reminiscent may seem to be cautious qualifiers, withholding express confirmation of this position, Home Team's later words suggest otherwise.
So again, he's stating that Home Team History claims that the Dogon do have some scientific knowledge, and that he is only putting that qualifier there as a way to have an escape. And again, I think you should be careful of clickbait and looking at YouTube videos as scientific papers. In a sense, I think a lot of people, they lose a lot of understanding of YouTube by looking at it as if they're scientific papers. And there's a stylistic component where you have to address popular ideas. Otherwise, you're not doing your job, really.
He concludes the video with the statement, quote, all in all, the Dogon seem to have orally recorded significant amounts of ancient African knowledge. Their culture not only preserves their own identity, but it also preserves invaluable scientific knowledge.
So I'm a big fan of oral history. And I think that a lot of history in Africa, which was captured orally, was captured historically correctly because of the way that it was captured, where it's a repetition of what happened in the past. It's not somebody telling someone something and then someone else tells someone something. It's a way more steady thing than that. In fact, to the point that we know that some of it that was captured in the 1700s stayed accurate because it was documented in European books up until the 1900s, when it was completely deleted. And a lot of people, a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of Africans have no idea about their own history or culture, oral history that even children would have known in the past. But again, this is where the problem starts, and you start going into pseudo history, where you start to interpret that oral history can tell you a lot about other people's tribes. You can only capture so much with oral history. And this has nothing to do with the limitations of the people, but the limitations of human beings in general. There's only so much information you can tell people until that information starts to singe at the edges and change dramatically by the time it reaches a third or fourth generation. By the way, this is not merely an attack on oral history, but history in general, because some written history is only as good as the people who read it. Like when we read today's history about ancient Greeks and ancient these people, we put in our own interpretations, like they're white, they're from Europe, all of these things, which they might not have acknowledged themselves. Now, I do know they acknowledged they were white and they acknowledged that they were from Europe, but I do know also that they looked at other Europeans as if they were not white, and they looked at other Europeans as if they were not from Europe. And I know this because there was a huge debate between me, other people, and more people who had to bring in the evidence, and we could see that some people, some ways they divided the world, the continents, are not as simple as how they divide them today.
End quote. Finishing with the claim that the Dogon culture, quote, preserves invaluable scientific knowledge, end quote, is a tacit support of the claims the video made previously.
Now, to defend Home Team History on this, he says it seems, and before he bootloaded it with interpretation and all of that. So I think he knows that a lot of that is actually nonsense, and he was just riding with it for the video. and then stating his opinion later. But again, I'd have to see the original video. I've heard him talk about the Dogon before, and my impression was not that he believed that they knew about science and physics and stuff like that. I don't think that's all the impression that I got when I watched his video on the Dogon.
which also included assertions about advanced medical and genetic knowledge the Dogon apparently had centuries before European contact.
Now, again, it depends what you mean by genetic knowledge, because a lot of people had information about genetic knowledge, but not DNA, but they understood like how people come about and all of this. So it depends what you mean by genetic knowledge. And also the other one, medical history. I can show tons of evidence that a lot of Africans had all kinds of medical history that Europeans didn't have at the time. And a lot of medical history that comes from Europe came from the Middle East. And that is a fact. By the way, I don't think this person meant to say before European contact, because there's also Middle Eastern contact. I think what he meant to say modern contact or modern scholarship. I think calling what people are doing now in medicine European is kind of a dangerous thing to say.
Perhaps you might think that given the qualifications and cautions Home Team uses, these videos are sufficiently moderate in tone to avoid misleading people with unhistorical claims. However, a glance at the comments section of the videos demonstrates that many viewers are entirely happy treating the bolder statements as fact, regardless of the careful wording.
Well, that's not his problem. If people are misinterpreting the truth,
accompanying them. I want to be clear that this kind of content is not reflective of Home Team's work as a whole.
I will definitely agree on what he is saying right now, that this person does have videos which are much better in terms of analyzing the information that's there. Now, I will say to some degree, a lot of it to me is too mainstream for me to, not that I don't care, but for me to look at it as different than anything that I can get from other European channels, like channels made by European people. But I will say that it is pretty well done. Like, for example, when I looked at the Kingdom of Mali from his interpretation, I'm not saying mine is better than his. I actually think his is better than mine. When I looked at his to as a reference, right, to go and check, which I didn't use as a reference because I go check what he says, and then I go check original sources, books written up by Griots, like the people in the 1800s, and I saw some information that doesn't line up with what he said. So I just decided to leave it out. I'm not saying that he was completely inaccurate or anything like that, but I chose to leave it out because I don't think the history of it is that good or bad. Now, there was another video, a documentary that I saw that was about 4 hours or 3 hours long. I don't remember. I watched that one for inspiration. And even that one had a whole bunch of inaccuracies everywhere, which is one of the reasons why I just like reading the information so that it's not my interpretation of what happened, but someone else's interpretation who was there.
But there are enough videos of this nature on their channel to give cause for concern.
So I'll give you one example of something that I actually didn't like that he did, but I'm not saying I hate the channel or anything like that. I'm just saying one thing that's like mainstream. So the Kingdom of Mali has its own name, right? And he caved into that and was like, okay, I'll call it by its original name, just like how Kemet, for example, has to be called Kemet by its original name. But as we've discussed with Metatron and people like that, Kemet is not the full name of Egypt. It's actually something closer to Kumat or something like that. So if you want to be accurate, you would have to go and use that interpretation of the name. But even that is speculation because the vowels were not stated in ancient Egypt. But also, if you look at the Mali kingdom, it didn't have one name necessarily. And a lot of these names come from outsiders or it comes from insiders, but insiders who are writing for everyone. And an empire that big had multiple names. If I relate this again to something that's easier for me to understand, let's take the Zulu kingdom. The Zulu kingdom, that's one of the names that you could call it, but it had a bunch of other names as it grew. There is also the problem of interpreting it as one giant empire as well, that people did not continue to call their small region with their name rather than acknowledge the empire as a whole, which is something that really happened after the Europeans were writing about it in history books. Take one more example. One word you'll hear a lot if you look at Zulu history is impi, IMPI, which means a regiment of soldiers. This word is fine and it was used, but again, it's regional. I could show you in a dictionary that there's plenty of words they used, and a lot of the times they had a name for a specific regiment, and so the word impi would not be used inside by those people except when interpreting it in a specific way. But if you look at Zulu history, it's like they're separated in impis and da 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 and all this other stuff. But again, this is all regional. And then of course there's like female words and male words.
It's not merely that the videos themselves sometimes contain speculation and sometimes give credence to poorly sourced claims, but that they sometimes reflect an effort at reconstructing the history of Africa in a way which actually privileges European achievements.
Well, that probably has to do with some of the success of the channel because the audience is familiar with European success. So, obviously, to try and compare it to European inventions is a strategic thing. Now, obviously, on my channel, I've tried to show that thing that Africans used to climb the tree. I'll promise you, people didn't care as much as I thought they would. But if that thing had been connected to some modern technology, a lot of people would care. And to be fair, the word invention is very vague. Like a bucket handle was pretty good in the past, but today it's rubbish since we have computers and all this other type of stuff. So you have to compare it to something. You have to put it on some level. Like, okay, this invention was good for tribes. This invention is good in a modern civilization. This invention would be good in China, or this invention would be good in Native America. If you don't compare it to anything, then even a stick for digging can be a great invention. I mean, think about it relatively. When the first humans started using stones to throw at animals in a much more sophisticated way, sharpening them and stuff like that, it's pretty impressive if you put it in its period. But if you put it today, who cares? It's pretty bad. So that is probably why there is this comparison. I understand that the Afrocentric ideas, which are good, didn't creep, but were entered inside of the academic circles. And therefore, they started saying that comparing things via the European and thingy is wrong, but to some degree, I think that's inaccurate. I think you should compare civilizations to one another, especially if you want to range where they are in their development. And I don't think that's bad. I also don't think that it's a good idea to say if they range lower or higher that means that they suck as a civilization. But I think it is important to do that because it will tell people the type of civilization you're dealing with in a very easy way. I also think the reason why some people don't want to compare it to European civilizations is because a lot of European civilizations for a pretty long time fail in comparison to some of the African civilizations, which, especially during the Islamic era, had levels of writing that were above others in certain parts of Europe, even the mathematics, or on par with.
When people feel a need to discover that African civilizations had the same kind of scientific and medical knowledge as modern Europeans, they are demonstrating they place a high value on that knowledge and wish to believe that African people were as advanced, for want of a better word, as the Europeans.
In a vacuum, this makes sense. But there's a reason why people pay attention to ancient Egypt more than they pay attention to some other kingdoms. How much you've advanced compared to other civilizations matter, and how early you've advanced matters to the general population. Now, idealistically, you could say maybe people shouldn't do that, but they're gonna do that. I'm sorry. It's like saying we should not have the UFC because it doesn't matter who can beat up the most amount of people. That's not even that cool of a thing that they can do that. It doesn't matter. People care, and they decide on those factors alone which civilization to visit.
Or even that they were more advanced. This is not too far from the idea that in order to be valuable, African cultures must look like modern European cultures.
I think that's reading a lot of information inside of that statement. I do believe that, yes, sometimes you have to make comparisons with Europe, but I don't think Home Team History always makes a comparison with Europe. And I don't think he puts a lot of value. I mean, he's made videos that I've seen that are purely about tribes. So clearly, he does show some value to people who today we wouldn't consider sophisticated. And I think it's kind of different when you compare someone like a Eurocentric doing it and just a person who, let's say, this would be ideal, someone who doesn't have any bias doing it.
Dr. Jennifer Vest, a specialist in Indigenous philosophy, has termed this the excavationist school, a historico-analytical approach which attempts to build a counter-narrative to European exceptionalism by digging through African history in search of African precedents to European achievements.
I have to state that this is not a European thing. I've seen Indian cultures, Indian historical cultures, and Indian historians do the same thing. I've seen this channel do that by mentioning people who discovered in the early years of the Islamic Golden Age, who discovered some of the history or some of the scientific and mathematical achievements before the Europeans as well. So everybody does this, and they do it for a reason. It seems like a good attack on someone that you're saying that European inventions, but it's not European inventions, it's factual inventions. Did these real inventions exist? I mean, we hear people today saying we don't know how to build the pyramids, trying to say that the ancient Egyptians had a level of advancement over people today. But to read that as always as just comparing it to European culture, I think is incorrect, as compared to just comparing two different types of inventions in a way.
She writes that this constitutes, quote, the search for a glorious African past heavily influenced by a desire to set the record straight with regard to where exactly the cradle of civilization is.
Now, I could respect that opinion if the majority of, well, not the majority, but a good chunk of historians today are still not insisting, if they were not still insisting that the Middle East is the cradle of civilization, and they're putting a lot of weight in the fact that it's the cradle of civilization. There's a lot of this double talk that happens in history where they say it doesn't matter where civilization comes from or what race they are, but then they go and do DNA tests to find out what race they are, and they use that DNA test to say, therefore, civilization started in this location. And for Africans to come back and try to find evidence that civilization started prior to that date, I think is fair. Now, if it's inaccurate, it's inaccurate. But that does not, but I don't think it makes it not noble when you know that the other side is doing it. And I will say it again, it will never stop doing that because people care who did what first. Maybe it's not cool that they do it, but there's no law you can put that's going to make people not care.
End quote. Adding that this is, quote, motivated by a perverse preoccupation with Western claims that Africa lacked civilization, end quote.
completely disagree with what she is saying. The obsession by historians on on the fact that people around the world are unfamiliar with African civilizations is not perverse. It's perverse that they don't even know that Africans had civilizations. I forgot where I saw something, but there was something where they were claiming that some people didn't even know that Timbuktu was a real place, saying it's perverse to push back on the idea that your entire race, your entire continent, and your entire peopleage or peoples did not have any civilization. Why wouldn't you be preoccupied with that? Imagine if someone said that about Europe. Europe had no civilizations, they didn't advance anything in science, and they didn't, basically they were just some people who lived in the jungle until Africans came and saved them. Are you not going to be preoccupied as someone who cares about history to try and set that record straight?
As an example, she cites Senegalese historian Cheikh Anta Diop saying, quote, "In his attempts to address long-standing prejudices against African civilization, Diop gets caught up in a systematic counter-European narrative." End quote.
I think it's kind of unfair to use someone like Sheikh Anta Diop, who literally was fighting against a version of white supremacy where some of the information that we have today is thanks to people like him. I mean, he was literally putting the foundational steps. So him having some things incorrect is very normal. But again, I think this is a exaggerated point, and I don't think that you can compare Sheikh Anta Diop to this person, hometown, and whatever history.
Caribbean anarchist YouTuber St. Andrewism has described this as Eurocentric Afrocentrism.
So I made a video about this earlier where I said that some Afrocentrists, of course, just push back against Eurocentrism, and that Afrocentrism that was founded in America to some degree is a version of Eurocentrism. But again, even Eurocentrism is a something that is interpreted through Islamic scholars. Even Christianity sort of became Islamicized to some degree when it joined through. You can't help that you have a past. That will never change. And we all are living through a biased lens to some degree. Now, that's why I, to some degree, separate myself from the word Afrocentric unless you use it in the most charitable way. That's why I separate myself from that word because, again, this will be the thing. You're Eurocentric Afrocentrist, meaning that you look at the world of Africa through disagreeing with Europeans, which I agree. Some people do that. But that does not, I don't think that describes home team history. I think home team history is very okay with European achievements, and I think he's very okay with Middle Eastern achievements, even if he thinks some of those Middle Eastern achievements took place in Africa in ancient Egypt.
Which they define as, quote, "constantly measuring and relating Africa's history to Eurocentric parameters of progress, rather than letting the unique, complex, and diverse history of the content stand on its own." End quote. In response to that comment, another Twitter user wrote, quote, "Home Team History made a YouTube video about this idea and how Hotep-style Afrocentrism does a disservice to the actual rich history of Africa and Africans." End quote.
I'm guessing that home team history did not use the word Hotep himself, especially in such a derogatory way, calling people who focus on Egypt as Hotep versions of African history. Well, let me just state something. So there is this call to action, or there's this call by people that Africans should focus, firstly, only where there are black people in Africa, which is not fair. I mean, Europeans focus on any place in the world. If they want to, they can just study Japan. So I don't understand why when you focus on Africa, you have to focus specifically on well, not even specifically, vaguely on the entire continent. If you want, you can specify and look particularly at one continent. If you disagree with the people and you think that most of those people are black Africans, that is your opinion. Now, do I think you're correct or incorrect? That has to do with your personal thing. I happen to think there were a lot of Africans, black Africans in Egypt, and that's fine. But to call that Hotep when we don't even have the answer yet.
However, St. Andrewism replied, noting that Home Team's own videos are not immune to the same kind of thinking, writing, quote, "It's good that he calls it out, but a lot of his videos adopt the very same framework," end quote. Having said all that, I'll now move on to the two instances in which Home Team history does appear at Our Bad History.
Perhaps that is a fair point. I'm not too familiar with that.
First was on the 19th of August 2020, when a commenter posted a solid debunking of Home Team History's video on the history of Egyptian hieroglyphs, writing, quote, "After having to debunk this video multiple times to different people, I decided to go ahead and make a comprehensive post on why Home Team History's Origin of Hieroglyphics video is very bad history."
I'm not too familiar with that video, and I'm not claiming that even if I was familiar, I would be the correct person to judge whether that information is correct or not. But, I'm not familiar with it, so I have nothing to say about it.
At the moment, Home Team History seems to be the biggest African history YouTuber, and his West African videos seem to be well done, but his North African and Egypt videos leave much to be desired.
I don't know what much to be desired means. Sounds like a very vague criticism. Maybe they don't believe it's as extensive as they would like it to be. Now, even if it's supposed to be and not supposed to be, let's just leave it at that.
Quote. The post was well received on the subreddit, with 688 upvotes and, more importantly, several comments providing additional details substantiating its argument.
If they don't like his interpretation of Egypt, they would hate mine. Now, I have to state that there's probably a reason why they have an opinion on Egypt and North Africa, since they are more studied than quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa. And it's hard to disagree with things from sub-Saharan Africa because a lot of people are not too familiar with the information. And the information itself hasn't been as debated as some of the Egyptian information. Remember, you can't take a lot of Egyptian information at face value. So even if you have a direct source from ancient times, it still has to be interpreted through knowledge that has been gathered after that.
Second appearance of Home Team History on Our Bad History was a post of my own, in which I challenged his video, "Were Women the First Mathematicians in Ancient Africa?", which argued that the Ashango and Lubombo bones, two bones up to 40,000 years old with specific carvings on them, are lunar calendars originally created by African women in what is now called the Congo.
So I'm very familiar with the Lebombo bone and the Ishango bone, and I have to say that yes, there's a lot of interpretation around it, because what can you do with a bone with a bunch of etches on it? So it has been interpreted as a calendar. I've heard some people say it has to do with tracking the female menstrual cycle. Some of them say it's about grip. Could be someone just doodling. So there's many ways of interpreting it. But I also think it misses the point that there's other things in Africa where you can go and check calendars. Now, the calendars are not going to necessarily match up with those, not that all calendars do anyway, not going to match up with those of European modern calendars or Chinese calendars or Ethiopian calendars, but there are calendars which are written about earlier. Of course, those two bones, I think, could be referring to calendars, but again, we have to be careful when it comes to stuff that's that old to put in stuff in there, because what if it's more sophisticated or what if it's less? How would we know?
I noted, quote, The interpretation of the Ishango and or Lubombo bones as lunar calendars created by women as the first mathematicians has not found widespread scholarly acceptance." End quote. And
Of course, this is due to the fact that it's so old.
provided the history of this idea, which extends back to the 1970s, before describing how and why it fell out of favour, since no one has ever found any supportive evidence for it, and since there is evidence to the contrary. See the link in the video description to my videos debunking this claim.
So I did actually see those videos, but I didn't watch them. That's actually how I got to this video. So yes, I will be watching those and reacting to them. Now, I'm not necessarily interested in those two bones, but I am interested in the mathematics of Africa, and so I will give other examples in another video of African mathematics that existed.
I will also mention that home team history does have a tendency to glorify kingdoms and empires in Africa, praising their military power and conquests, and representing them as examples of African excellence.
Again, this is probably due to a couple facts. One, the pushback of Eurocentrism, because Eurocentrism does make the claim that Africans did not have empires, and they also claim that Africans did not have great inventions and great things. And so the context is very different in this version of glorifying empires than the way Europeans did it. But you don't have to believe me.
Videos such as "What can we learn from Africa's greatest empire?" and "The Great Fulani Empire," and "How did the greatest African empire survive civil war?"
I can, of course, see how these could be interpreted in such a way, but I will again put that down to the format. I will put that down to how normal history is looked at on YouTube. I mean, there's a lot of words that I think academics don't like the word civilization. A lot of academics don't like words like that, but they're used all the time. And for what reason? Probably because they make sense to most people. If you remove the moral aspect of it, they still make sense to people.
And "Top 5 Muslim Empires of Africa," and "The Great Nubian Queen of the Egyptian Empire," are all rather too enthusiastic about empires for me to be comfortable with them, since I was raised in a very anti-imperial environment, and since anti-imperialism and decolonization studies were a part of my university education.
As much as I respect that opinion, of course, there is a bit of a problem in just viewing all empires as the same thing. Now, I'm not saying some empires were super great and some empires were not, but clearly there will be a difference in understandings. And of course, it goes deep. You'd have to watch my channel to understand how deep it goes with these quote unquote empires. And obviously, they did horrible things as well.
In the social context in which I was raised, it would be considered extremely offensive to write essays or make videos with titles such as "Top 5 European Empires" or "The Great British Queen Who Ruled a Global Empire."
Again, I can understand this sentiment, as I would agree that I would probably find it offensive if I saw the great European queen. But I think it's also because there's a different connotation when you look at it from the African's perspective and the European perspective. But again, you don't have to agree with that.
Or "How did the greatest European empire, Rome, survive civil war?" However, I won't take that into account when scoring his channel.
I will state, and I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, that the idea that Rome was one of the greatest empires does not offend me personally.
Significant weakness of Home Team's videos is the fact that sources aren't always clearly identified. On occasion, I've had to search myself for the sources occasionally mentioned verbally in the videos, typically in the form of brief citations of paraphrase, or only occasionally in the form of direct quotations, since they are not listed in the video description.
Yep, I also don't do this a lot, but I think it's because it's so easy to tell people with your own words, like where to find it. We're not living in the document era where I have to give you a name, and then you have to go through files and files to go find the word. If I tell you a heading and you look that heading up, you can probably find the source very easily. But that's just a preference. I do agree that putting it in the description is a good idea, but again, I think stating it if it's easy to find on the internet is the same thing.
Often I have looked up sources he has used and found he seems to have misunderstood them or failed to include their qualifications and cautions.
Again, this is an interpretation, and I would need to see it as well to understand if I agree or disagree that he misunderstood them.
Home Team History has 446 videos of the date of writing this script. I checked the 30 most recent history videos and found none of them provided a list of sources used in the video description.
Can't criticize him for that. I do the same thing.
However, virtually every video does obviously use some sources, even if they're only cited occasionally, and quite often they're quoted in full on screen. In such cases, 2 to 5 sources are typically used.
That's the same with me, of course.
Some primary sources were used, and academic and pop history sources were also used, with encyclopedias and websites being used occasionally. However, as I have noted previously, sometimes the sources are extremely out of date or low quality, as with the video relying on anthropological research from the 1930s.
Which is probably why it's important to state who said it and how they said it, and state that it's from a specific date. I do agree that some of the things from the 1930s aren't going to be as accurate, but again, that depends on what you're taking, because some interpretations from back then are useful even if they're not as accurate, as long as you tell people that.
In his video on the Dogon people's alleged scientific knowledge, without taking into account any of the significantly higher quality studies and research of much more recent years. On the basis of this and other criticisms, I am scoring Home Team History thus.
Now, here's the thing. I didn't want to talk about Home Team History. I don't want to talk about any other channel because I can understand how sensitive some people are about having their channel critiqued. I am too. I don't like the idea of someone taking my entire channel and then giving me a score. By the way, I will appreciate that if someone does it. I'm not against it. But at the same time, I understand how sensitive a lot of YouTubers are. So I'm not doing a critique. Most of this is not based on his channel. It's based on this guy's interpretation from this video that I'm reacting to. So I didn't do the research myself to go and check if this matches 100% with his channel. I've seen some of his videos, but like I said, as I am African, some of the information is inaccurate in the first minute when I see it, so I just abandon it, or it elevates things that I know Africans don't care about.
1 out of 5 for historical accuracy. I am subtracting 1 point for historical inaccuracy, 1 point for including pop history, 1 point for unreliable sources, and 1 point for outdated sources.
As harsh as that sounds, he's still much higher than some channels, which I'll be honest, I don't watch some of those channels, but I've seen them enough where I thought they had much more what I would call credibility than Home Team History just by looking at them. I didn't do the research, and to know that some of those channels are not that reliable is kind of scary, because sometimes I argue myself against some of those bigger channels and go, am I doing as much research to make sure that I'm as trustworthy as some of these channels? And to know that they're not that trustworthy is kind of scary, especially the one with the helmet on it. I forgot what it's called. Kraut. I definitely have seen Kraut say stuff, and the way he delivers it, a lot of the stuff he says does sound a little bit accurate. Now, I remember he was part of a weird political side of the internet, so take that into consideration. People think I only watch African content. I watch European, African. I downloaded a 12-hour documentary which was subtitled about Japanese history. Again, that guy says, just like every other YouTube researcher, that don't take everything he says to heart, and he's not meaning to offend anybody.
4 for source verifiability. I am subtracting 1 point for not revealing all sources in a reference list. 3 for citation integrity.
I was gonna say he probably would hate my sourcing if he doesn't like his, but if he gives him a 4, then he must give me a very high number, since I almost always boringly read the original information. And I almost always start with irrelevant information, and I do this because I want to show the whole page rather than read the one part. I've seen people read where they're like, "Oh, did you know there was this in Egypt?" And then they read like two sentences of a full page thing, and I'm like, "What's behind that? What's above and below those statements?"
I am subtracting 1 point for a limited range of sources and 1 point for not assessing sources critically. 4 for criticism frequency. I am subtracting 1 point since the channel has only occasionally been called out for criticism.
Okay, so a lot of these are his personal interpretations, and I was gonna do a long video about how he's judging channels, but I think this video is long enough, so let's just get through this score.
With a score of 12, I place Home Team History in the C tier. While this is the highest score I'm going to grant any of these channels, I'm still not happy about having to score Home Team this low.
So, yep, he actually likes the channel and he wanted to score it higher, but of course he put in a criteria, or he put in a certain thing that he describes where he has to put the channels, and he had to put it as a C to be consistent and accurate with his list. I agree with him that of all the YouTube channels on YouTube, when it comes to accuracy, including some scientific channels, I would put Home Team History up there at the top of what I've seen. Now, I say it again, I've never watched all of the videos. Some of them, it's interesting, but not deep enough for me.
This is a one-person channel producing a very wide range of content in an underrepresented niche and making a very obvious effort to do proper research. They go above and beyond most history YouTubers in identifying their sources and making themselves accountable.
So he moves on to another person, and so I'm going to leave it here. So, what I'm going to say about this is I respect the fact that this person, Home Team History, is this good of a YouTuber. I think he fully understands how to interpret information and how to put it out there, which I think is some of the reasons why points were taken away from him. But I think he understands how YouTube works and what people want, and how to change your mind, and how to deliver a message in a heartwarming and somewhat accurate way. Me, I usually watch really boring channels that sit down and give the information slowly in drib drabs, and that's usually my inspiration. A lot of those channels don't cite any of their information, and I've played some of them on camera where some old lady is just talking about ochre in some random place in Africa. And I think that is a much better way to reveal African history for real. Now, I will say that at one time, I wanted my entire channel to be an animated channel where I just draw animations and I put it out there. But then I actually watched some channels with all of the sparkliness, and I found myself dozing off where I wouldn't even care about what was being said. I was just looking at the sparkliness, and I suddenly realized I'm not learning anything. I'm just looking at the sparkliness. And so I kind of pulled back a little bit on that. I still want to work on animations and put them out there. But again, like I said, a lot of these channels where they do that, I think a lot of them, they don't realize that they're podcasts and they're just something that people can sleep to. Whereas others like these, I mean, it's a compliment that I even have one person watching my channel, because I've seen channels that go deep in history from universities and they get like 300 views. 300, because it's boring. You have to kind of know what subject it is to try and get it. And so only the strongest will survive, which I kind of appreciate to know that I've got. So anybody who's in my channel, just know you're the strongest in terms of information. If we lived in ancient Egypt, you would probably be the seekers, the knowledge keepers. Thank you for watching.